Hey, welcome to Unlatched Mind. My guest today is Matt Legge. Matt is the author of a book, Are We Done Fighting? Building Understanding in a World of Hate and Division. Matt has worked for Canadian Friends Service Committee, which is it's a peace and social justice agency of Quakers in Canada. Matt also has a degree in anthropology from the University of Toronto. The discussion Matt and I had was really focused around ways we can improve how we approach conflict with each other. Debating and fighting, everything, whether it's online or left versus right in the political arena, whatever it might be. It should be okay, right? We need to be doing that, but there's a way to do it more productively, especially in this time of cancel culture and where if you say the wrong thing, people want your head. So anyway, Matt had written a blog where he walked through 7 tips for improving discussion and debate, and we'll walk through those. And Matt in the blog really uses a letter published by Harper's magazine as the backdrop. So we'll talk about that as well. Anyway, let's jump in. I had a great conversation. I give you Matt Legge. So Matt, thank you so much for your time. I know you're super busy. I really appreciate your time. So before we get started, could you just kind of give the listeners a little bio of yourself? Tell them who you are, what you got going on.
Sure, yeah. So I am an author, a blogger, and I work for a nonprofit organization in Toronto, Canada called Canadian Friends Service Committee, which is the national peace and social justice agency of Quakers, the Religious Society of Friends in Canada. For Psychology Today, I write a blog called Are We Done Fighting? And I have a book on the same topic. And it's about polarization. It's about how to disagree with each other without destroying each other. Yeah.
So what's the answer? Are we done fighting? That's going to be a hard no.
There's the guy, Johann Galtig, who is credited as founding the academic discipline of peace studies, had a great response in his endorsement quote for the book. He said, no, we're not done fighting, but we can fight in a better way.
Yeah, I like it, yeah.
So that's what it's about.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah. It's there's that fine line between debating, expressing ideas, and then it just goes over the line to just caustic arguing, and it's just hostile, and it doesn't.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are tired of that.
Oh man, I am. I'll tell you. I mean, social media is, and we'll jump into your blog in a second. But yes, I mean, it's exhausting. It's just truly exhausting when you just see, and it's just so predictive. You can just look at everything, and you can see no matter what it is, it's an immediate two-sided political or non-political. Just there's a group that's thinking X, there's a group that thinks Y. Mm-hmm. And that's it. So that's a perfect tie-in to your blog. So your blog, Are We Done Fighting? On Psychology Today is where I found where I originally found you, and then your latest, I think it was your latest article called Cancel Culture Letter. Mm-hmm. Cancel Culture Letter: 7 Tips from the Debate. So I love doing things like this because it basically helps me just understand this domain of just political divide and the argumentative world we live in, and confirmation biased, and how to truly understand the other side, because I feel like everything is compromised to make any progress forward, whether it's morally, whether it's politically, whether it's career wise. You gotta it's compromise is so important, But it gets complicated, it really does. And I think so reading articles like this and all, I think is super interesting. So I guess the letter that you had kind of summarized and you were referencing in the article, who wrote that letter? Give us a little background on what this letter was and what the intent of the authors, what the intent of the authors.
Yeah, so the letter was published in Harper's, and it was signed by, I think, over 150 prominent academics and journalists. And I think it was originally drafted largely by a guy called Thomas Chatterton Williams, who works for Harper's. And then they asked for signatories, but I don't know all of the back and forth. And there's been some controversy about how that process happened. And some people who signed the letter said they wouldn't have signed it if they knew who else was signing it and stuff like that. So
right, yeah. And I mean, what the letter basically was saying? What?
Right. So it's actually a very brief letter. It's only about
Mhm.
500 something words, and it just basically argues that the debate is good and they support even caustic debate, but what they don't support is kind of punitive responses where if I say something that is deemed offensive, then people try to get me fired or otherwise quote unquote canceled.
Right,
Um,
right,
and yeah, but the letter is very vague and very general.
right.
And I saw one interesting reaction, which was to say that this is a real downside with a lot of mass signatory kind of letters like this, is that you have to try to appease everybody.
Right.
And so in order to get a whole bunch of people to sign on to a letter, you generally have to tone down the language or make it more and more vague to be more appealing to more people.
Right.
So I do think that happened in this case where the letter doesn't provide much in terms of specific details about, what exactly it's concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, I read through it and you give, you reference it throughout your blog here, but I read through it and I read it once, then twice. Like you said, it was really short, so you can rip through it pretty quickly. And I didn't see anything controversial about it. I at least initially I didn't. I was like, well, yeah, who wouldn't agree with this? I saw all the signatures. I'm like, okay, that all makes sense. But then I started reading a lot of some of the references you had made to it, and there was a lot of I mean, just like anything online, right? There was a lot of hate towards that article, and what there was the anti-trans position, and there was all these other things that I don't know where that came from. Was there some backstory to all that, or was that just folks? I don't know what her name was. What was her name? The one of the I think she was a trans woman that you had referenced it as an anti-trans
Emily
dog whistle.
Vanderwerf, yeah.
Yeah. Is there some backstory that to that whole article, or to the author, or some of the hidden agenda of the authors, or was that just folks reading into stuff that maybe was not there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think this points to what happens in a lot of different conflicts that I studied. And I'm talking about international conflicts. I'm talking about local conflicts. It's very easy to start reading into stuff and to assume the worst about whatever the other person is saying or doing.
Right.
And I'm not saying whether or not that's accurate. I don't know. So in this case, a number of people read into it that it was anti-trans. The letter itself does not explicitly use the word trans, and it doesn't really say anything about trans or gender issues. So I think that is the claim that it does, or that that's what it's really trying to say secretly, I think is being made by people based on who the signatories are, and based on past support that they've had for certain anti-trans positions, some of the signatories.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what I gathered just by kind of reading some of the posts that were more or less attacking the article. And again, like you said, you don't know, I don't know, we don't know but if you read just the English words in that article, it'd be very hard to say, look, see how I mean. I just don't know how you'd get that from there. But again, we don't know, who knows some of the personal backstory and all that. But and I think it's interesting how it touches on exactly your tip number 4, right? Which I guess we can jump around here. But so you went through and basically used this letter as a backing to employ in I'd say recommend 7 tips to a better dialogue, if you will, right? So in this case, you had said tip number 4 is if you want to have more rewarding disagreements, try to steer them away from the moral domain and get specific, right? Yeah. So in this case, I see this as a perfect example of what you had just said. This article was very open, very vague. You could almost overlay any perspective you may have and fit the narrative of what you're looking to I guess, define the narrative that you're looking for and say, look, the article fits that. And it's because it's just so general, you can almost fit anything into it. And to your point,
Yeah. And I think that happens a startling amount of the time, where you and I think that we're having the same conversation about the same issue. And then we're going along and it's going fine. And then suddenly you say something where I'm like, wow, we've been talking about a totally different thing this whole time.
Yeah.
And what's happened there is that you came with your own perspective, I came with my own perspective. We thought we were having one conversation, we were really having two conversations, which were our own viewpoints on an issue, right? So as we're talking about something, like you're trying to form a picture of it in your mind, I'm trying to form a picture of it in my mind. The more abstract and vague it is,
Right.
the more difficult it is for me to do that. So if you're telling me something in very specific, concrete terms, if you're using sensory language, if you're using, colors and the smell and what exactly happened, I can picture that really easily. I can generate that image in my mind. But if you're talking about something really vague, what I think I'm going to do is probably just fill it in with whatever my personal experience is, which has nothing to do with your personal experience. And so we think that we're on the same page or having the same conversation, but I'm really picturing something very, very different. So what I usually find happening is people are talking in these kind of abstract, broad, moralizing kind of ways, but they're not thinking in those ways necessarily. They're really thinking about particular incidents and particular events in their own lives. They're just not saying as much.
Right. Yeah, you can't not overlay your own personal story to what you're perceiving, right? It's just how our brains work.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's interesting. You had quoted, I think she was I think she was a doctor, a medical doctor, Rachel Penny or something. And I want to read this quote because I think it's you just kind of articulated it, but I think it's super on point. She said, when two people meet to discuss one subject, they are actually discussing two subjects, which are the two people's viewpoints. I was like, that's awesome, because that's exactly what you just articulated, and it's so on point. I mean, I come to the argument with my viewpoint, you come to the discussion with your viewpoint, and we're really not arguing the main, the centralized, I would say topic. We're really kind of arguing the two sides, more or less.
And I think it gets even worse because I think that the cleverer we are, the more formally educated we are, the more that we feel that we should be able to understand anything without having to ask for clarification and stuff like that. So we don't really like to ask those questions. And so we just assume that we are on the same page and are talking about the same things a lot of times, and we just aren't.
Yeah. Humility goes a long way. And I don't know. One thing I've learned over the years is just assume you just don't know. Just assume you don't get it, and you always end up, and that's not a recipe to be like meek and shy and just, but just, and open-mindedness is, it's an overused term, so I kind of try to use it less, but just generally be open-minded where, hey, I'm probably not the smartest person in this room or in this dialogue or in the, there's a perspective I just don't get, it's, you're right. You start to, the more intelligent you think you are, I think it just blocks that that open palette of understanding that,
Yeah, and there is some research on that as well. Like, basically, a lot of us are engaging in motivated reasoning. And so what we're doing is we want to believe something, and then we're drawing from whatever evidence we can think of to help us support that belief. But the more educated I am, it means I've read more, so I can draw from more. So it actually just makes me more creative a lot of times in supporting whatever belief I want to believe, whether or not it's factually correct.
Right. It's like a double-edged sword, yeah. So we like I said, you had those 7 tips, and I do want to kind of touch on each one really quickly. We talked about 4, but we'll bounce all around. Your first tip was stop focusing on who deserves to feel what.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, this is something I see happening all the time, is that rather than talking about the situation, the specifics, the issues involved, or talking about our own feelings or our own needs, which almost never come up in these conversations, we're talking about you don't deserve this, or you don't deserve that, or you should feel this, or you should feel that. And, I think, look, all of us have had this experience, right? So I'm in a heated debate with someone. I say, you should feel that. And they say, you know what? You're totally right. I'm going to start feeling it. And then they start feeling it, right? I mean, that's what happens in the world. No, of course not. Yeah. Never. It never happens. Right. But for whatever reason, we get really stuck in this should domain, which is kind of the abstract domain. And again, bringing it back to our own feelings and our own needs can be really powerful. Bringing it back to our own values and shared goals with the other person can be really powerful. So I just think those are more powerful positions than trying to tell someone how to feel. And feelings just don't tend to change on external command. You shouldn't be offended by that. Get a sense of humor. It's like, well, that may be factually correct, but it's not your most powerful way to motivate that person to change, right?
Right. Or the infamous calm down,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
has calmed no human being down ever. It's like, yeah, no, it's true. Oh, interesting. I wonder if it's. I mean, are we just yeah, that's an interesting perspective. When we say to other folks, you should feel this, you should feel that. I mean, are we just projecting like our own? I mean, there's got to be something there. Like what? Like I don't know.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like a. Again, first of all, we don't understand what the perspective of the other person. We don't really know what's going on in their mind. So saying you should feel X is almost narcissistic in a sense.
Yeah. And I see this happening across the political spectrum of people telling each other what they should feel or what they deserve to feel, based on, their identity, based on their politics, whatever it is. And I think it's so much time and energy gets wasted on those kind of conversations that really, if somebody feels something, whether or not it's a reasonable thing to feel does not matter because they feel it.
Right, exactly.
So,
yeah, right.
they're already feeling it. So you can tell them why it's not the right thing to feel, but it's not going to change their feeling.
Right. Okay, yeah. Jumping to tip number 2, you say first listen and show that you care.
Yeah, so I had used the story in here of Megan Phelps Roper, who has a really interesting TED Talk, and she has a book out. She grew up in the Westboro Baptist Church, and so from the age of 4 years old, she's going out and protesting and holding up signs that say God hates Jews and stuff like this.
Yep.
With her family and all of her support networks. And so everybody she cares about in the world is teaching her what's right, and this is what's right,
Yep.
And so fast forward to when she's an adult and she's using Twitter, and there's a bunch of people that are on Twitter basically doing the same thing of shouting at her, and it's not working. And if anything, it's making her feel more morally righteous because her identity is already a morally righteous outsider, So it's exactly reinforcing that identity to shout at her and say, you should feel this and you don't deserve to be blah, blah. So instead of those things, some people decided that they would actually reach out and, ask her what's going on, like try to find out how did she come to believe what she believes. So this is reframing the situation from me versus you to me and you versus the situation, right?
Yeah.
So we're on the same team and we're curious about how did we come to these two different positions. So they were asking her these questions with genuine curiosity, and it took a long time. Okay, like these interactions took place over direct message over Twitter for more than a year, but she wound up leaving her church, leaving her family behind, cutting all of those ties, and going through a really painful and difficult identity transformation. All because some people on Twitter reached out with genuine curiosity and warmth, right? So they showed that they cared about her. And when she realized that they cared about her, then she had to accept that they weren't the monsters that she had been raised to believe that they were.
Right.
And when she had to accept that, then she had to accept that actually she wasn't as righteous as she had been led to believe either.
Right.
So the whole world was a lot messier and a lot less this clean us versus them camps than what she was thinking. And that really was the seed of that transformation for her.
Yeah. Now that one's, that obviously was that one went viral in the Westboro Baptist Church. Yeah, I mean they would. It was pretty crazy what they would do right outside funerals and God hates gays, and it was it was pretty crazy. And obviously they got a lot of I would say headlines because of it. Now that one's weird too, and I have I think a running theme in this, and I think I've actually I wrote it down a couple times in the notes. The religion thing makes things complicated. Now she was able to break free of what she was brought up to believe. But if you take maybe her parent, now I don't know this family, I don't know anything about them, so this is just speculation. But I would imagine, maybe she didn't in her. Her parents, or for example, that they're ingrained in that. Like if someone really believes that this is God's will and way, and this is what I'm supposed to be doing, it's almost like society they're not going to have that open-minded, viewpoint. And I don't know how you break through that when someone has this, quote unquote higher power that's saying, no, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So all you humans, even if you don't agree with it, I feel like it just complicates it to the next level where you can't even have this civil debate because you could always be superseded by this overarching belief. Well, this is God's word, right? And that's what they really believed, right?
Yeah.
And and
Yeah.
so I don't.
And that doesn't even require religion to get there. Unfortunately, what we find in a lot of studies on these topics is when you provide people with very convincing evidence that what they believe is wrong, they're likely, if they can't find counter evidence, to try to first of all poke holes in that evidence that you provided. And if they can't do that, then they're likely to shift to the moral domain. So then they say, well, it doesn't matter that the evidence is opposed to whatever gun control. It's just my natural right to have guns, or it's my natural right to not have guns. So then it becomes not about the evidence anymore. It becomes more of a morality or a faith-based argument.
Yes, right.
And as you say, religion can be very powerful in that way, but it's not even necessary per se. And of course, I also want to highlight that, I work for a faith-based organization that is very much promoting diversity of viewpoints rather than kind of dogma. So there are groups doing that as well. And, obviously morality and faith can be used for very, very positive ends as well as very, very negative ends. So it has the whole spectrum there. But I do agree that that overlay of morality is a very tricky one.
Yeah, I mean, because you could always just play that card, and then it's almost like your trump card, whether it's right or whether it truly works or not. The person espousing it works for them, and it's like, well, that's my right. And then next, yeah, interesting. All right, jumping on to your tip 3. Assume that just like you, the other party is a unique individual, not just a group member, and then that they think that their intentions are good.
So that's exactly what Megan, is a good example of, is that she was literally going out and, wishing death on people. And at the same time, she was doing so because she believed that was what God wanted her to do for the higher good,
Yeah.
So she knew she was harming people. Of course she did. But she thought that she was doing it for something noble. And, I think that I'm doing what I'm doing for something noble. So actually we have a lot in common.
Right.
As much as we are going to taking totally different actions from those values, the underlying values are probably not actually all that different. And there's really interesting research on human values. And this research has been done in over 80 countries. And the model that I think is quite interesting has 10 common human values. And the reason I think it's interesting is because every time I ask people what their values are, the people who come to the talks that I give, they all cluster into universalism and benevolence. But those are only 2 of the 10. So these are folks who are not thinking about, social power and other areas of, stimulation, hedonism, lots of parts of life that are really, really important. But that's not the first thing that comes to their mind, right? Whereas if I was giving a talk to a different audience, that would be the first thing that comes to their mind. So it's not that these things, none of us care about them. We all have them to a different degree, and they can be intensified or not depending on, how a conversation is framed.
Right.
So, if you get me to there's an interesting study that'll give an example of this. So they asked men to remember a time when they had been nurturing as fathers. And the men who had done that in this study, randomly assigned and everything, were much less homophobic, and they showed less sexism in responses to later questions. So basically what's going on there is they're tapping into an aspect of their own identities. It's not something that wasn't already there within them, but it was primed. They were made to think about it rather than to think about something else. And there's other studies that I've seen where if you give men at random, you give them the feedback that they're really effeminate, then they support wars more, they support violence more. more interested in owning an SUV, etc. So depending on how you prime someone, you can bring something out in their character that was already there. You can, motivate them to focus on one value or a different value.
So that's interesting. So make sure I understand those studies. So in the study about asking men, so this was about whether or not remember a time when they were nurturing. So was this like one specific like test or test subject where they were asked that question, and then later questions in the same exact test they showed a difference in response of being more open to open to more, I guess. What did you say? They were less homophobic and.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it was the same subjects. Yeah.
Oh wow. So I guess on the other side, men in that same test that were not asked next time they were, to remember a time they were nurturing, I guess they tended to be more homophobic later on in the questioning.
It hadn't changed their viewpoints, hadn't softened on those things.
Hadn't softened. Wow, interesting. Yeah. Huh. That's fascinating. Wow. Very cool. Yes, on your tip 3 here, assume the other party is good and they have their intentions are good. That I had this conversation a while ago, and I think I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but I was asking someone, we were in a similar discussion that you and I are having, but I had said, some debates are so personal where it gets so just people get so passionate and they get so wrapped up in things like the pro-life, pro-choice discussion. And I said, well, all right, playing devil's advocate here, what if, a pro-life person believes truly that a pro-choice person is killing babies, right? Like what is, how do you get your head around understanding that perspective? And then, we talked through it a little bit and I think the example came up, well, think about, a pro-lifer that has seen many children grow up that were, a pro-choicer. Perhaps their perspective was shaped by seeing a lot of children growing up unwanted, right? They just weren't wanted. The children have horribly, struggling lives because the parents truly didn't want them, and it got me thinking, instead of thinking, oh, they want to kill babies, think, well, they're not focused on that. They're focused on unwanted children is such a horrible thing. What can I do to help that? Oh, maybe being a pro-choicer is there, so you just understanding the other side from a different perspective, you kind of, it softens the edge against the other side. And that was just an example, but it was an example that I thought I had cornered in terms of, well, two people can never come, see each other's side. And then, the other person brought that up and I said, wow, that's brilliant. If you really, so.
Yeah, that's a great example. And there's a psychologist, Peter Coleman, at Columbia, who does exactly what you're describing in terms of bringing two people together in the lab who have extremely opposed viewpoints on controversial issues like abortion.
Yeah.
And so he runs this lab called the Difficult Conversations Lab. And what he finds is that the people who there's some people who their conversations just descend into real animosity towards each other, and it doesn't get any better. And they rate it as a terrible experience, and they are not happy that they participated in these studies.
Yeah.
But there are other people who, in spite of being in a room for an hour talking with someone who they strongly disagree with, at the end of the session, they say, you know what? I don't believe their viewpoint now. It's not like I've changed my mind completely, but that was a worthwhile experience for me. And so, what's going on there? What's the big difference? Well, what Coleman's team has found is that it's complexity. So it's not that I agree with you. It's that I both disagree with you and I still have a feeling of genuine curiosity or of human warmth, or, I'm having a rich range of experiences all at once.
Yeah, right.
Conversations that are going badly, they don't have that complexity. They're just negative.
Right.
So it's not about being meek, like you said before. It's not about agreeing with the other person, being passive, whatever. It's about saying what you believe, but also remembering, trying to remind yourself to not be too certain about it and to not make those judgments that the other person believes what they believe just because they're evil, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, basically that lab has found that the way that you frame the initial conversation can really change how it, whether it stays complex or whether it devolves into this really simplistic, unproductive debate. So one way that they can do that is if they frame it as, okay, you're pro and you're con of whatever issue, go in there and argue for your position. That is going to be a bad conversation typically. And if they frame it as a more nuanced and complicated issue, so neither person is fully pro or fully con, there's a lot of nuance and points to consider. And then if they frame it in a way where rather than defending or advocating for something, the two parties are together exploring for the accuracy of understanding overall of the issue, those are the conversations that tend to stay much richer. And obviously, individuals with more complex, cognitive abilities, emotional abilities, are going to be the ones who find it easier to stay in that complex terrain and not fall into the simplistic judgments, the kind of binary logic of I'm good and you're evil, or I'm right, you're wrong, or whatever. But there is good news that there are various studies that show that complex thinking can be taught. So it's not something that you're either born with or you don't have at all.
Right. Yeah, I mean, as we're talking, I'm thinking, well, this all sounds like a lot of work. You know what I mean? Like the average, and are there any studies that, I guess, correlate IQ to how well someone can engage? I mean, we talked earlier about the smarter the people are, they tend to just dig their heels in more because they can attain more information quickly that backs up their perspective. But is that pretty much it? Where really is it a function of IQ in any way, or is it?
Yeah, this is an interesting question you just raised. I'm aware of a few studies that may shed some light on the topic. So one is that a study where they got people to memorize random information, which is a good way to tax their brains so that they're already kind of tired and distracted. And when they did that, then people's moral judgments of situations became much more simplistic. So that suggests that it is, like you're saying, it's cognitively tiring to keep that complexity and nuance, and it's much easier to just make a simple judgment of your evil. And there are other studies that show, and these are just correlational, but they're in the real world, that show that political leaders become less complex in their speech about enemies as they become more likely to go to war. And conversely, peace agreements are correlated with increased complexity in leaders' speeches about the other party. So I think there is a way in which we can be nudged in either way, and it is very easy to fall into those simplistic judgments. I know that I do it, and I have to kind of remind myself to let those go again and again. But I also know that there are people who just have an emotional intelligence where they connect with others on a deeper level, and it doesn't require a lot of thought on their part. They just do it. So I don't think it's necessarily all about being analytical and stuff like that. I think it can be done by having a sense of shared humanity and just focusing on that feeling of warmth for the other person, regardless of whatever viewpoint they happen to be saying, even if you strongly disagree with it.
Right. Yeah, interesting. Establish common ground and compliment before critiquing. That's your next tip here.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, there's a lot of common ground. Take someone that I strongly disagree with, that I talk about in the book, Jordan Peterson. I give an example around his use of pronouns, not to debate all of his ideas, but
That's right.
The pronouns debate came up around the time I was writing the book, first drafting the book. And so it had a lot of elements of all these things that we're talking about, where it was very entrenched and very simplistic and very antagonistic. And identity was really wrapped up in there for people on both sides of it. So it once it becomes part of your identity group to not yield on an issue, it's much, much more difficult for you to be reasonable and thoughtful, right? And so, but I may disagree with him on a number of things, but I also learned a lot from listening to him. And I, have a ton of common ground with him. So before I jump into the critique, I would need to, first of all, say the things that I learned and the things that we have in common. And that just sets a different tone. Again, it's like, if I said a bunch of things to you and you just listened, and then as soon as I was done talking, you just told me why I was wrong, it's hard for me to feel like we're on the same team. It feels like then I'm just attacked, and maybe you haven't even heard what I had to say. So more than likely, I'm just going to repeat the thing that I said in the beginning without listening to you.
Right.
Exactly. So then it's just, we're not having a conversation.
Right. Interesting. All right. I have a bunch of questions here, but let me just rip through your last two tips, and then we'll have a little bit more of a closing dialogue. So consider that you have your own biases, and the other side may even partially be correct. Seems common sense, but it's really not to a lot of us. You think, right?
And the more that you feel that you're moral, the less likely you are to feel that way. So, I see this phrase a lot in the work that I do, because I'm mostly in a left-wing bubble, is, the right side of history, and get on the right side of history and stuff like that. And you see it on, rhetoric about going to war, either you're with us or against us. That kind of simplistic binary logic, again, is kind of, it's tough to break out from, but it is not serving you all that well.
Yeah, right. I mean, especially with politics, you have to have, you can't, we always have this discussion about, how could our two-party system be fixed, and this and that. I'm obviously referring to the United States in this case, but it's all this nuance and all this gray area. It's much too time consuming, right? You and I are having an hour conversation, give or take, and we can dive into the details and just ponder this and talk about all the nuance. But, when decisions have to be made out in the real world, I just don't know if it's realistic to, I don't know. I wish it was. It just seems like it has to go. You have to either pick a side and move forward. Like, otherwise you'd have just so many gray areas and so many different platforms and so many different, I don't know. It's like it's almost like you need the machinery to to build behind one giant monolith to create momentum to get anything done. And if you had everyone thinking in nuance, and just there'd be no teams, and there would just be kind of everyone's, I don't know, hugging, and nothing would get done. Like, you know what I mean? It's kind of a, maybe in a perfect world without the forces of economy and things that we need as humans. I don't know. Maybe that's a pessimistic way to look at it, but I just feel like the system has evolved the way it has because of these real life forces at play, and maybe it's just human greed and things that drive it all, but regardless, I feel like it's still reality. Which I love. One of the reasons I love doing this podcast, stuff like this, is because you can have the open dialogue. There's no one telling me what to say, what not to say. Move on, get to the next point. Whose side are you on? I'm like, I don't know. I'm on Matt's side. I'm on my side. I'm on everyone's side. It doesn't matter. I don't have to pick a side. But if I was talking from Capitol Hill, I certainly would have to pick a side. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, it's a real luxury to have time. I definitely agree, and I think that's one of the things that's happening with social media. Is it's very easy to get outraged and jump on a bandwagon extremely quickly without really understanding the issue you're even talking about.
Oh yeah.
And then there's a lot of group pressure too, right? So studies of groups find that in various different groups, people themselves, like members within that group, will silently admit to the researchers that they think the group's positions are too extreme.
Right, right.
But they don't want to say that to the group because then they could lose their status, they could lose their standing.
Right.
That's a huge risk to take, to be perceived as, not on board or singled out. So I understand those dynamics a lot, but internally, you also have to remember that groups are a lot less homogenous than they appear to outsiders. Yeah. So that's a really important point. That's whatever group, Republicans, Democrats, whoever it is, they have a lot less in common. They agree on a lot less in terms of just being a homogenous monolith than you might imagine.
Right, right.
And so there are usually points of entry to have conversations if we don't assume incorrectly that everyone is kind of against us and dislikes us and whatever. At the same time, I agree with you. There's a lot of different forces. And I think, especially if you get into politics, then you're talking about political, commercial, certain powerful donors, et cetera.
Right.
All of that is hugely impactful. And the media too, mainstream media. So, things are reduced to very short sound bites, and the typical framing of any issue is one side versus the other side in a battle for supremacy.
Yep, exactly.
And, there's really, there are some great groups trying to help with the opposite. So there's a Solutions Journalism Network that is working directly on training journalists to complexify stories and pick up on points of commonality between the parties and pick up on persistent disagreement or persistent unknowns. Because there's always a lot that people don't know.
Yeah.
So it depends, again, how you frame those questions. But there is also a lot of research on diverse groups. And what that research finds is, and I mean diversity of all types, including ideological diversity and diversity of expertise. And what that research finds is that people who are in diverse groups, they don't like it more, and they don't find that it's a faster or easier process to work with, but they do come up with better quality solutions to problems. And I think there's a few reasons for that, but one really interesting reason is if I know that I'm going to be talking to a bunch of people who already agree with me, we're speaking the same language, and I'm just going to present my ideas. But if I know that I'm going to be talking to a bunch of people who don't necessarily agree with me, I'm going to put in more effort to think through my positions from various perspectives and to try to make them airtight, because I know they're going to be questioned.
Yeah.
So I'm going to come up with more precise ideas as a result of that. And there's going to be these different perspectives that can, bring new understandings and new ways of looking at the problem that I just simply could not have had because they aren't, my experience. So there's a lot to be said for that way too, but you're right. It's slower and it's more painful and people don't necessarily like it.
Right. No, interesting. Yeah. So last tip, and we kind of touched on this already, but you try to keep your thinking complex. Realize there's always more to the story than you're currently aware. Just seems obvious, but I think we all think we have a monopoly on the truth at times, and that's almost never true, if ever.
So let me give you an example story that I really like from this one. So I was leading a workshop, and it happened that a couple was paired together, and they were doing just an icebreaker exercise. So they were talking about a toy that they had as a child. And afterwards, in the debrief, the husband said about his wife that they had been married for over 50 years, and he had just heard a story from her that he had never heard before. And so he said, no matter how well you know someone, you never know their whole story. And, that is exactly correct. There's always more going on for people than you realize. Yeah. So it's very easy to forget that, and I do that, but it's a helpful reminder when you can think of it.
Yep, no doubt. Yep. Now, one question I had as we're walking through all this is moral conviction is important in a lot of ways, right? I mean, it does a lot of good. I mean, so as you want to be a better negotiator, that's probably a bad word, but you want to be a better debater. You want to see, you want to be less, binary thinking. Everything we just talked through. But how do we keep from just entering a world, a wishy-washy kumbaya.
Yeah.
Everyone's right. We're all happy. Let's all hug. Like, how do you know, there's got to be
Yeah.
passion and conviction, and a lot of it, how do we just, in more relativism gets messy, right?
Right.
You're right.
Right.
You're good. Everyone's good. How do we navigate that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and it's an important point. So I would say, first of all, there's a conflict model to look at, and it puts on the one axis relationships, and on the other axis it puts your interests. So basically, how much do I want to get my own way in this situation? How much do I care about my relationship with this other person in this situation, right? So if I don't care about the other person at all and I really want to get my own way, then my conflict style is going to be called directing. If I care a lot about relationships and I don't really care about getting my own way, then my conflict style is going to be called accommodating. I don't think that either of those are usually the best conflict strategy, but depending on the conflict, they may be. So nothing is written in stone here. But generally speaking, you don't want to go for either of those first off for various reasons. But one of the good reasons is that there could be a way forward that neither of you have thought of yet. And so if you're being too wishy-washy, you're not going to think of it. And if you're being too directive, you're not going to think of it. And the other reason, obviously, if you're being too directive, you're going to, leave a wake of hurt feelings and stuff behind you. So you may not want to do that depending on the situation.
Right.
Or it may work better for you depending on the situation. Another thing that's really important to recognize for everyone in conflicts is that just being silent or just being passive, keeping things inside, just doing what other people say to not rock the boat kind of thing is not a more moral position than being more aggressive or confrontational.
Right.
It's, if you think about, there's an interesting concept of a pool of meaning, like a literal pool. Imagine that you are putting, between you and I, as we have this conversation, there's a pool of meaning, and every time one of us says something, it's like being poured, water into the pool. If I'm not saying anything, then I'm also withholding information from you, and so it's just as detrimental to your understanding and to the pool of meaning between us as if I was, aggressively saying a bunch of things and throwing it in there. So it's just to say, I don't advocate that at all. I think we need viewpoints, and I'll give you an easy example of where binary logic can be super helpful. The flat Earth conspiracy that's going around right now. The Earth is not flat, so you don't have to have a long debate about it. You don't have to look into all the evidence. You don't have to, be nuanced on your position. You can it's an either or question, and the answer is no. But you can be interested in how did this person get to the belief that the Earth is flat, and so I'm not advocating spending all the time looking into all the evidence on every issue, because I think that's impossible. There's way too much out there. And at the end of the day, we all have to decide on sources to trust and trust ourselves to a degree as well. But it is helpful to have some humility in that, and also to remain curious, and especially curious about how did the other person get to where they got to.
Now, that flat Earth thing, I'll play devil's advocate for a second. Okay, well, just to start, I don't believe the Earth's flat, but the whole premise, I think, is the same. Is it not? Where a flat earther, assuming they're sane and they truly believe it, and didn't they reach that conclusion based on their consumption and their processing of the evidence they've been given or they've consumed? Whereas another person on something that's obviously much more debatable than the Earth's flat has kind of reached that decision based on more or less the same mechanics. So who are we to say the flat earther is, like, again, to try to understand, like, I think, well, maybe to your point, you certainly advocate trying to understand how that flat earther came to understand that perspective. But it seems like the mechanics by which, we all get to that, I'm going to put my flag in the ground and say, this is what I believe. It's almost like the mechanics to get there is the same, whether it's flat earth or whether it's pro-life, pro-choice, or whether it's I'm a Republican, Democrat. You know what I mean? So it's almost like who are we to say the flat earther binary thinking's okay there?
Well, I guess my point is in that case, I don't think there's a need for a nuanced position of maybe the Earth's a little bit flat. Um,
That's right. That's
because it's an either or
right. Yeah.
question. Either the Earth is flat or it isn't flat.
Right. Right.
So there are either or questions out there, and there are questions where, if it's a question about, I don't know, housing policy, there's a lot more complexity to that question. It's not just an either we do this housing policy or we do nothing.
Yeah.
There could be a whole bunch of different ways forward. So those are the types of topics that require more nuance and more discussion, maybe. But
Yeah.
you know, it's people don't come up with ideas from nowhere, right? All of my ideas in this book are cited by sources, and that's because I believe those sources. But it's possible that some of them are wrong, and we've seen that a number of psychological studies have been questioned recently through various techniques that they've used to analyze the data that may or may not be accurate. A bunch of them can't be replicated, right? So yeah, there are very real questions that you can always ask about how trustworthy a source is and how people come to their information. And at the end of the day, I don't know very much from direct experience. Almost everything I know is because other people know it.
Right.
And other people share that information with me.
Right.
And so I'm very vulnerable to what other people in my networks are sharing. And vulnerable in a good way that it can spread really useful knowledge, and also vulnerable in a negative way that I can believe things that just aren't true.
Right. Yeah. And we have to be prudent and actually pay attention. Yeah. It all sounds so exhausting. Cancel culture. So we'll close with this. Now, the title of the blog was Cancel Culture. So, and the theme throughout your blog was pretty much, we talked about the tips and all that. But cancel culture, first of all, it seems to me to be a real thing where someone steps out of line even a little bit. The haters say they should be fired, they should be thrown off the, deplatformed, whatever. And the institutions, just like that, just like the letter articulated, respond in my opinion, overreact, respond, and want to just keep the bottom line solid, and just they cave and they fire the person or they deplatform. At least that's my perspective. So is this truly as bad as it seems, or is it not necessarily? Where's this going? I guess cancel culture.
Yeah, I think it relates to a number of the trends that we've been talking about, where you're basically seeing the other person as, dangerous and negative, and trying to get them deplatformed, canceled, whatever. And there's some evidence that could support a position like that. So, for instance, there was an interesting study done in Poland that found that as people were exposed more and more to hateful white supremacist content, they didn't start agreeing with the content, but they started seeing it as less dramatic. So it just didn't register for them as much. They were desensitized to it. And so I do think that happens a lot. And so you could make the argument that we need to cancel people so that their viewpoints don't become, mainstream, or don't start entering a phase where people in the general public are just desensitized to this and think of it as more normal. And then on the other hand, you can look at a lot of examples where people are simply uncomfortable with what they perceive to be someone's ideas, and they probably haven't even engaged with those ideas to know.
Right.
So they're advocating canceling someone whose book they haven't read, for example.
Right.
And so there's obviously a real danger with that, and with the kind of creating intellectually homogenous environments in places like universities. And there was a separate letter that was signed by another 150 people a few days after the cancel culture letter came out in Harper's, and it was critiquing the letter, and it was basically arguing that people have always been kept out of institutions. It's just that the methods are different. So they might be kept out by hiring decisions. They might be kept out by editors deciding what to publish and what not to publish. And now it's this other form of canceling where it's through a lot of public pressure and backlash about, invited speakers at universities, etc. And so I think all of that is true. I don't think that there is something necessarily new about cancel culture. I don't think that it's something that necessarily happens just on the left. And I think that there's really interesting writing by a sociologist called Musa Al-Gharbi, who has written a lot about the history of this. And he says that, you can see a lot of parallels to earlier conversations that were happening in the 90s and that were happening before that. So I'm not sure how much of this is actually new, but I still think that there are cases that have been written about, and quite a number of them, not just a handful here and there, that are disturbing. And there's cases of social media pylons where someone, makes a dumb and uninformed tweet, and it kind of ruins their life to a large extent, or it has huge repercussions for them. And so I am concerned when those kind of things happen, because I think there are major drawbacks to that approach of trying to shame people. And quite frankly as well, when you're feeling shame in your body, it's not a great moment for you to actually learn something new. It might be a great moment for you to perform like you're apologizing, but that's about it. So I don't think this is also causing deeper learning and deeper transformation for people. And that's ultimately where I would like to see more energy focusing.
Yeah, the trend, and I think right now, whether it's left or right, historically, I think the left is monopolizing at least this cancel culture segment of at least my life that I can remember. But regardless of which side it's on, what gives me a stomach ache is just watching, someone makes, like you said, an irresponsible tweet. And yes, is it irresponsible speech? 100%. But should their entire career be ruined? When that person may have had no history of anything besides that. Now, if there's a systemic problem and there's a history of this person, maybe that the administration or organization they're with should maybe second guess. Do we really want this person's representing this person's character is representing us, and maybe we should not keep him or her on board. If there's a history, and that's just, but any company would do that, right? Any company, if I'm if I walk into my company in a couple of weeks with swastikas on my forearms, the company's going to be like, what the hell's going on here? I don't think I'd be there for much longer, right? Nor should I. It would just be very detrimental to the culture. But, one irresponsible tweet when someone has a completely clean record, and there's plenty of examples, and it's just like, they immediately get their head cut off and their entire life is ruined. And it's like, okay. And I think you mentioned it at some point in the blog where that doesn't. Now, an irresponsible tweet is if it's a joke or if it's someone just expressing forget the jokes for a second, because people make stupid jokes all the time. But now it's digital and the entire world can see it, and it's permanent, and it gets backed up. If, the servers all around the world will never go away. But when someone's trying to make a political point or they believe something and it's construed as a little bit off, they can have their head chopped off too. And it's like, and then you see them apologizing for it, which is even worse. And they try to apologize, and it's really, like you said, it's like they can formulate almost a shallow apology just to keep their career alive. And I agree with you 100%. I don't even think they're processing it yet. They're just in defensive mode. They're kind of like, what just happened? And they're giving this weird apology about, I didn't mean to say that. Where in my opinion, they should just said, I made a stupid joke. I'm not a bigoted person. I'm not a racist person. Everyone get over it. Like, I want them to say that, because that would almost, as opposed to, I'm so sorry, I have black friends, and they just go down all this like weird, they get in this weird like place of apology where it's like, you're apologizing for something that you should say, yeah, I made a stupid comment, I shouldn't have, but look, everyone relax. I'm not an XYZ person. Look at my history. Like, I just feel like, I don't know, the apologies I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's just nauseating to see how easy someone can be to platform now. And whether it's what really scares me when someone's trying to make an actual point and they're trying to just toe the line because they can't actually be passionate. Like, we can have a passionate debate where I'll say some things that if I'm truly being passionate, and you in my perspective could be extremely sincere, but I have to have to dive into, I have to like put my toe in some waters that are pretty controversial. I want to be able to just speak my mind, and I want the other person or the whoever is perceiving it to know that it's coming from a place of compassion, but eventually you gotta go to those deeper waters. But I don't think people do it because they're afraid they're gonna just lose their entire career. And it's
and I think that's the good point, is like, what is your goal here as the person who's calling people out? Because you have to have a theory of how is this going to help the situation, how is this going to change people's behavior. And if your theory is basically, it seems to be just a theory of punishment, this person did something wrong and now they should be punished, and that's a very shallow theory, and it doesn't look at where does this go next, how does this lead to future behaviors from people.
Right.
And so again, I'm not advocating at all that there shouldn't be consequences when people cross genuine lines. I think we need to be careful about where, as societies, we put those lines, and that's never an easy question at all.
Right.
But I think we need to look to ways to engage people and engage in learning and education more than punishment. I just don't see that as ultimately all that beneficial. So if somebody gets a platform to spout views that are really negative for one reason or another, it would be good if other people had the same quality platform to counter those views. That would be really important.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, the if it bleeds, it leads kind of mentality creates. The people that have this more hateful platform will generally grow quicker than folks saying like you and I. I mean, if I went off on a bigoted or anti-racial slur right now and just published this podcast, my listeners would probably go through the roof. Just because it's terrible to think that, but that's how it works. But
yeah, there's a lot of people, I think, successfully gaming the online system and those algorithms for what's going to get 100%. Boosted by being controversial.
Yep. And look, you and I just having a civil debate, a civil conversation, I mean, it's just, it's not nearly as exciting. Yeah. But anyway, so Matt, I do appreciate your time here. So you said you had a book. How do folks find the book? Where is it?
Yeah, so it's the book is called Are We Done Fighting? The website is arewedonefighting.com. And I'm also offering free workshops right now for anybody that's interested to study the book together in an online forum. And it's 90-minute discussions once a week. So they can find out about that on our website, and the registration is there. It's quakerservice.ca/registration.
Cool. Excellent. Yeah, I'll put those links in the show notes as well so folks can see them. So, all right, Matt. Well, I really appreciate your time. It's a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. All right, man. Well, have a great rest of your weekend, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Vinny.
All right. Thanks so much, Matt. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that's it. We're done. Check out Matt's material at arewedonefighting.com. We'll see you next time. See ya.